Welcome everybody to the webinar, Steps for Transitioning to Safer Chemicals, the OSHA Toolkit and Training. My name is Saskia Van Bergen, Green Chemistry Scientist at the Washington State Department of Ecology. Switching to safer alternatives is complicated, so we organized this webinar today to share information on a toolkit and training that can help organizations on their path to identifying, prioritizing, and switching to safer alternatives. We have three great speakers today. Their names are Jessica Schiffino, a health scientist at OSHA, Harvey McGill, a lead instructor, continuing education specialist at the University of Washington Pacific Northwest OSHA Education Center, and Jennifer Frey, Sustainability Program Manager at Selling Construction. With that, I'd like to pass you over to Jessica Schiffino, who will be talking about the toolkit.
Great. Thanks so much, Saskia, for that introduction. So as Saskia mentioned, I'm a health scientist. I work at the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in Washington, D.C. in the Directorate of Standards and Guidance. And we've been working over the last several years to think about how alternatives assessment in the context of worker safety and health can happen and how we can help support it, and highlight some of the resources that we've developed to lead employers and workers through this complicated process. And in doing this work, we recognize that reducing chemical hazards and really transitioning to safer alternatives without risk trade-offs that lead to unintended consequences is not easy. So the tools and resources that we have to start this work are really critical, and we're happy to share them with you today. Before launching into the tools specifically, I wanted to give you a little background about why we started some of this thinking and what the problem we're really trying to address with these tools are. So how did we get here? As many of you are probably already aware, hazardous chemical exposures have a big impact on worker health. While we don't know the exact numbers about how many workers are being affected by these exposures to hazardous chemicals, some recent estimates suggest that more than 190,000 illnesses and 50,000 deaths annually are attributable to these exposures. Currently, what OSHA does to protect workers from chemical hazards is to establish permissible exposure limits. However, as many of you are probably also aware, this process is really complex, it's time-consuming and resource-intensive. And because of that, many of the PELs for chemicals that we do regulate are very out of date. And unfortunately, we only have exposure limits for a small subset of the large chemical universe that workers are exposed to on a daily basis. We have exposure limits for about 400 chemicals, and we have comprehensive health standards for only about 30. And many of these standards were also set at the outset of OSHA in the 1970s based on information from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So they're, for the most part, really outdated and not adequately protective. And as I mentioned before, we know that workers are exposed to so many different chemicals every day, tens of thousands even, and it's really not possible to take this chemical by chemical approach and set exposure limits for every chemical. In addition to the problems with our current process for chemical management, over the last several years, the landscape of chemicals management broadly has really begun to change. In Europe and in U.S. state governments, like in Washington state, as well as leading businesses, have really been shifting more toward comprehensive and systematic chemical management efforts based on some of this alternative assessment thinking. And these frameworks have the goal of not only eliminating the most hazardous chemicals, but also replacing them with less toxic alternatives. And as I mentioned, Washington State really has been leading the way to systematically address some of these chemicals of high concern, especially in products for children, as well as promoting the development and implementation of green chemistry innovations. In addition, current market pressures coming from customers as well as outside stakeholders are creating incentives for companies to reduce the use of hazardous chemicals. While some of these are more focused on the consumer or environmental end of things, all of the pressures really offer significant opportunities for a transition to a safer workplace. There's also more data available than ever before about chemical hazards, so it really supports more robust decision-making about chemical use. And in addition, there's also increasing recognition that chemicals and products are important sources of exposure. And these sorts of exposure sources really blur the lines between workers, consumers, and environmental protection. And the current approaches, like I discussed with exposure limits or chemical by chemical regulation of the most hazardous chemicals, without really thinking about what the alternatives will be and what will be used instead, really don't adequately address some of these problems. And I'll get into a little bit more about the different approaches and what the outcomes have been in the past and how we can use that as a lens going forward. So there are really more incentives than ever before to really push in the direction of safer alternatives, and more recognition that the way that we currently approach chemicals management is really not getting to where we need to go. I'm going to highlight two specific examples of managing chlorinated solvents to show the different outcomes achieved using the current approaches, chemical management, versus approaches that incorporate more of this systematic, holistic, informed substitution and alternatives assessment thinking. So OSHA's regulation of methylene chloride illustrates some of the unintended consequences of a chemical-by-chemical risk-based approach that really focuses on controlling exposures to a safe level, like a permissible exposure limit would, and does not really think about what's going to be phased in instead, or evaluate trade-offs of other potential alternatives. In 2013, there was an expose by the New York Times which highlighted several workers with severe neurological damage from exposure to 1-bromopropane in a North Carolina furniture factory. Their research highlighted how companies began using this chemical as a substitute for methylene chloride once OSHA and EPA regulated it to just avoid having to deal with those regulations altogether. And of course, 1-bromopropane was not regulated, and nor was it considered during that regulatory process. And so by focusing one chemical at a time and not really considering the implication of the alternatives, this regulation that was designed to protect workers really resulted in the phase-in of an unregulated neurotoxicant and possible carcinogen, and along with it, subsequent adverse impacts on the workers that were using this substitute. The state of Massachusetts took a different type of approach toward trichloroethylene and the way it was being used in that state. They looked at toxic use reduction planning as well as implementation of those plans to really move toward reducing the use of a hazardous chemical and transitioning to something safer. What they did was, under the Toxic Use Reduction Act, they required facilities using certain chemicals like TCE to go through this whole planning process, which really focused on identifying and evaluating alternatives to the chemicals of concern. And in conjunction with the requirements to plan and evaluate alternatives, they had several different parts of their state agencies that were tasked with providing various resources to encourage and facilitate the voluntary adoption of safer alternatives. And they provided resources from technical assistance to educational workshops to databases of safer alternatives, and also doing a lot of performance evaluation of the alternatives. And so through a combination of these efforts, where it was more holistic thinking about what needs to be used and what should be used, coupled with technical assistance to support the transition to safer alternatives, Massachusetts companies reduced the use of TCE by more than 77% since 1990 and completely eliminated its use in several industry sectors and replacing it with safer alternative in the process. These examples really help demonstrate the value of informed substitution and highlight how embracing substitution can be a path forward for reducing chemical hazards throughout the supply chain. They also illustrate how chemical management issues really bridge both OSHA and EPA silos and show how utilizing proactive, preventative approaches to solve these problems can benefit both workers and the environment while avoiding some of these risk trade-off situations that negatively impact one while benefiting the other in the process. So it's really clear to us that proactive preventive approaches that drive the elimination of chemical hazards at the source and promote the implementation of safer alternatives are really needed to complement these traditional regulatory approaches. The good news is that these types of approaches are really nothing new. For example, the industrial hygiene hierarchy of controls really long recognized substitution and elimination as the preferred approach to controlling hazards. This strategy is also consistent with pollution prevention approaches that are largely considered and implemented in the realm of environmental protection. And in practice, this amounts to eliminating the use of hazardous chemicals or substituting them with a less hazardous alternative. While these methods may seem fairly straightforward in the abstract, we understand that in practice they can be quite complicated and in many cases difficult to accomplish. And, you know, even the previous example of methylene chloride and that regulatory process showed how even when you're focused on reducing one hazardous chemical, if you're not thinking or evaluating the other alternatives, how you can have those unintended consequences and risk trade-offs. So we really need to think not just about doing substitution, but doing informed substitution. And this really speaks to substitution as a process where you need to go through several steps to broadly consider a wide variety of chemical and non-chemical substitutes and really compare the important health and safety implications of what you're currently using and the potential substitutes. And this is also a proactive, solutions-oriented approach, and it asks a different question than traditional chemicals management. Not how much of a known hazardous chemical can I be exposed to, but rather how can I complete the task in the least hazardous way. And because this process attempts to proactively ensure that a replacement for a chemical of concern is safer and healthier, it does avoid these regrettable substitutes I was speaking about earlier. So what have we done to try to help facilitate this process of transitioning to safer chemicals? OSHA has developed a toolkit, first of all. It's an online resource. You can access it using the URL that is on this slide that you're seeing. You know, many people ask us whether they can go in the toolkit and just put in the chemical that they're using and get a whole list of safer alternatives. Well, unfortunately, it's not really that simple. As I mentioned before, implementing alternatives that are truly safer and don't result in regrettable substitutions requires completing a systematic and continuous planning process for assessing the chemical hazards in the context of each workplace. And the toolkit and how we've laid it out attempts to give people the outline for this planning process. 7 steps that people can use to apply systematically and continuously to achieve chemical use that is safer for workers. We also have links to various tools that people can use to help achieve each step of the process. It's suitable for a variety of audiences, from workers to employers. It can be used in any industry, anywhere where you're working to manage your chemical hazards. And the main function really is that it outlines this stepwise process as well as serving as a repository for existing tools that can help people achieve those end results. What you're seeing now on this slide is how the homepage of the toolkit uses, and it provides this visual representation of the 7-step substitution planning process. The process helps users start out by forming a team and developing a work plan with safer chemical goals, inventorying and evaluating their chemical use to identify targets for substitution, identifying efficient, safer, and more sustainable solutions to hazardous chemicals, systematically comparing the hazard costs and performance of different alternatives, organizing information on alternatives to evaluate potential risk trade-offs and select alternatives that will improve worker safety and health, and finally, to plan, evaluate, and fully implement a safer alternative. If you're on the website and you click through this diagram, clicking on each of the steps of the process takes you to a separate page for each step. And while I'm not going to go to the website today, I have a couple of screenshots of what you'll see embedded within each of the steps on this online toolkit. Each step page right here, we're looking at the information that you'll see for step 4, which is talks about assessing and comparing alternatives. It's really filled with information, resources, and tools that help users understand and complete each step. It starts off with some key questions to think about when you're trying to complete a particular part of the process. and then also has a larger description and explanation about what this step really consists of. It also includes key examples that you see on the right side of this slide in the gray boxes that are particularly useful for completing the activities that are identified in each of these steps. For people who want to dig a little deeper, there's even a complete list of resources and additional links that are provided. So what's the sort of information that you're going to find here? On this step 4 for assessing and comparing alternatives, it really helps to walk users through the process of completing an alternative assessment, or a way to compare hazard, performance, and cost for each alternative that you've identified that you might be interested in using. The key questions walk people through issues to consider, such as what sorts of endpoints and safety criteria should I be comparing? The description that we have in the toolkit walks users through what they'll need to do to prioritize some of the alternatives, as well as assess them based on hazard, performance, and cost. And then for the key tools and resources, we have a few that can help you achieve the comparative assessment process, such as the column model, which is a tool based on GHS classifications that you would find on a safety data sheet. QCAT, an assessment tool created by the Washington Department of Ecology that uses a subset of high priority hazard endpoints to grade chemical alternatives, and P2 OASIS, which has just been newly refreshed. It's a really helpful tool where you can go in and enter attributes of different alternatives, and it will score those alternatives based on a variety of quantitative and qualitative criteria. And so this is just scratching the surface of the information that's available within this toolkit. And I really also want to reiterate how using these resources to learn more about transition to safer chemicals process can be useful not only to protect workers and those focused on occupational safety and health, but can really be helpful to achieve environmental protection or consumer protection as well. And given that the traditional OSHA and environmental management roles within many organizations have been integrated, additional chemical management tools such as substitution and all of these tools and resources to support doing informed substitution are really critical for bridging these worlds. And the processes and tools that I've described here and fill the web toolkit are really, whether the end goal is to reduce hazardous chemicals in the workplace environment or in products, it's all really the same process. And like I said before, and just want to reiterate here, using this process is really critical for minimizing the risk trade-offs and avoiding regrettable substitutes that are really needed to protect entities throughout the life cycle of chemicals and products and processes. After we built the web toolkit, we realized that for many people, reading and having access to the resources was not going to be enough. We wanted to be able to provide some hands-on training on some of these tools, as well as the 7 steps of the process. So what we did was, in conjunction with a variety of partners, developed a course to provide this sort of training for this process, the transition to safer chemicals, as well as to really dig into using some of those tools and methods that are embedded within the online toolkit. So we developed OSHA course 7225, Transition to Safer Chemicals, with the idea that participants, after taking the course, will learn how to complete all of these 7 steps and become more familiar and comfortable with some of the key tools and resources that we find help with each part of this process. So now I will transition over to Harvey, who will give you an instructor's perspective on what the course offers.
Hopefully everybody can hear me out there. Thank you, Jessica, for such a wonderful overview and background of the importance of this particular topic. I'm glad to be able to participate. I'm one of our lead instructors in our region for a variety of courses, and I'm really excited about this particular one as it has emerged from the needs that Jessica detailed and the purpose of it. My role is as a facilitator of that course is to administer it through the intent of the program. And on your screen, it should indicate the core purpose of the curriculum that we administer. And as Jessica said, it's really designed to be a proactive approach and a systems approach to help in the reduction of hazardous chemicals in the workplace. And she also keyed in on this hands-on experience and the process. And I think that is one of the highlights that the participants really enjoy the most from my experience with the course, facilitating a number of times now, is that they go through a step process as was outlined, and they are kind of guided. The curriculum actually consists of 6 lessons, and all of them are associated with a workshop. And so we're utilizing adult education principles to utilize the great experience and backgrounds of the participants that attend these courses and have them in cohorts work together and learn how this process works. And most significantly, I think, is what we try to give them a training action plan so that when they actually walk away from the course, they have the ability to work with their employers and to help put the transitioning of that information they receive about the process into action. We find a great variety of people that are attending the courses, and you see on your screen the targeted audience that the curriculum was really designed for. And there are a great variety of people who have attended with great level of degrees of academic background to none. You don't have to be an industrial hygienist or a chemical scientist to be able to participate and learn as a representative through your organization. And one of the huge benefits, definitely, of the attendance is the great collaboration that you get with other participants and to learn from each other. There is a systems approach to the learning techniques that we have tried to incorporate as we go through those 6 lessons and utilize the tools to help build the understanding of what a safer alternatives team is. So when you actually put into practice your training action plan, you can know how to work with the different stakeholders that are involved and share that information that you've obtained through the course and help build the understanding and infrastructure within an organization to be able to then evaluate and assess the particular types of chemicals you're working with presently and what are some of the other ones that would be much better solutions. The overall toolkit concept and the other associated tools that we provide in class and that we utilize in the workshops really augment what was created in this 7-step process, and the participants get a chance to utilize those and work together to help learn about them and then find ways to put them in practice in their particular organizations. The outcome is really predicated upon each of the steps. And as you can see in the diagram on the screen, the first part of this diagram illustrates the step. Initially, the participants learn how to build that team and who those members should be, and then find a way to create a plan and an approach that's really going to have to sell some of these ideas to management and help them come to the understanding of the benefits that can be derived from the choices to search out and substitute with safer alternatives. As Jessica highlighted, that was just a couple of the cases where there's some huge negative consequences to the workforce. And this is a hot topic out there. A lot of people are interested in this. Every class, it seems like there are stories where participants share experiences where family members, coworkers have had their experience with chemical exposures and detrimental effects to them and their families. So going through each of these steps and examining, their current use and identifying alternatives, and then comparing those and contrasting what are the benefits and what are the positive things that are going to be a result of this, and then actually coming up with an informed decision about your safer alternative, and then using a pilot study within an organization to actually put this into practice and showing the success of it to an employer is a huge tool benefit that ultimately allows them to see its effectiveness. The real key part, I think, also is the participants not only learn a systems approach and a very proactive approach and go through case studies, but they have an engagement to look at the significant roles of all the stakeholders and identifying who those are, and then putting together that plan to work with the stakeholders, whether they're internal or external, to be able to come up with successful alternatives that will definitely save them not only money and time, but also, most importantly, the well-being and health of their employees and their partners that they work with. The overall process, most of the participants really enjoy the experience and learn a lot about the tools that have been created that they were just totally unaware of. So very successful experience I've had with it. I really enjoy teaching the curriculum. It's very challenging, but it's very fast-paced. It was originally created in an 8-hour format. We're using a day-and-a-half format, and it seems to work really well. It's very engaging, and there is a really good response to the content. Our next speaker actually attended one of the courses that I facilitated, and I think Jennifer will give you a good idea of some of the things that she took away from that and how she enacted her own internal training action plan with the information she provided. So I'll turn it and pass it over to her at this point.
All right. Hey, thanks, Harvey. Took the class with Harvey, I think it was a couple months ago, and I'm going to give you the student perspective on this. I work for Selling Construction, and we're a large general contractor building hospitals, schools, and sustainable office buildings. We use and supervise thousands of materials and chemicals each day, and we pour tens of thousands of yards of concrete in the state of Washington annually. And you might think that a construction material like concrete is quite simple, but it actually involves a lot of chemicals. There are thousands of design mixes with multiple ingredients like aggregate, cement, and chemical additives to achieve strength required, cure time, and adjust for weather conditions. And these chemical additives all make the adjustments possible. And once the concrete is poured, there's even more chemicals that go into properly finishing and sealing it. So concrete has certainly evolved over the centuries, but we still tend to think of it as kind of a harmless material. And when I started my career decades ago building houses, I wore gloves when I poured concrete because it irritated my skin, and I kept the concrete wet and wore a dust mask when I was saw cutting because I didn't like the dust in my face. But I never really thought that concrete was hazardous to my health. Now today I know that working with concrete and silica does present health risks, and OSHA and the state of Washington have standards in place to protect workers. And Selling now uses vacuum equipment and respirators, as you see in these workers in the photo here. So I took this class transitioning to safer chemicals because even though I've always been aware about irritant issues of working with construction materials, the decades of remodeling hospitals and building green certified projects, I became more and more aware of how chemical ingredients impact people's health and well-being. So I wanted to learn more about how to protect our crews. I've worked for Selling for about 18 years, and these men and women are family to me. So this desire to focus on worker safety and health drove me to educate myself. I took a HAZWOPER class at first on how to handle chemicals safely, and the next step logically for me was to kind of go upstream to learn how to select safer chemical alternatives to mitigate the hazards right at the source. And that's how I came to this class on transitioning to safer chemicals. In this class, the safety hierarchy, which Jessica showed earlier, this image here is something that I learned about in my chemical safety courses, and it was driven home again in Harvey's class, where you first eliminate the hazard if possible before you substitute or take steps to control the hazard with processes and engineering. And the last resort should always be putting on protective gear and actually handling the chemical. So this class brought together all of my training, and it just made sense about how I could approach my work and support the construction crews. I'm really glad I took this class because I learned so much in this day and a half. And I'd say that this class will surprise you. It is far more engaging than any other class or learning environment that I've experienced before. If I wasn't on the edge of my seat listening to Harvey, I was really engaged in conversation with the other students during one of the interactive group exercises. And these were thoughtful exercises that helped you work with the tools presented in the classroom. The training gave me the knowledge and the skills to easily explore tools like ChemHat on my own because I had already become comfortable with the tools. So what you learn in the classroom is going to stick with you. 2 days of discussing chemical abstract numbers could have been really boring, but Harvey made it memorable and he made it fun. He's really personable and he set a tone of trust and respect and engagement with the students, and I felt overall collectively the knowledge and the experience of the other students in the classroom was kind of like the other instructor in the room. Whether we were working in groups on an exercise or volunteering our experience as an example or a question, I was always engaged and learning more effectively than if I had just read a book or received a typical lecture. This was one of the great features of the class, and that shared student experience really added value. And again, I can't say enough about Harvey and the team that put this class together. They were really able to translate the scientific jargon into terms that even this contractor could understand. Chemical abstract numbers, the carcinogenic, mutagenic, and all the other types of toxicities can be a lot to process, let alone roll off the tip of your tongue. But the course was designed to make it easy to grasp these concepts and the details. And it also bears highlighting the quality and the breadth of resources that were shared. They didn't simply hand us a handout with websites to explore on our own time, but we thoroughly practiced using these tools. And as I have started to create a plan of action on my own and take these first steps of implementation, I've barely scratched the surface of what we covered in class. The variety and the different attributes of each resource will surely cover your industry and meet your needs. So I've talked about the instructors and class participation, and Harvey also mentioned the 6-step approach, but it bears repeating the slide because I felt the class was really well structured to really help focus everybody's process for students to be able to take action. So the training action plan, this is where the best part of the class came for me. It was a folded document that we were given during the last class, and we were told to take time in class to consider how we would implement this training back at work. And taking the time while materials are fresh in your mind to make a brief plan was a huge value. We all have good intentions once you're back at work once you get back to work, you get distracted, and all the tasks and the emails awaiting your return pull you away from these good intentions. So summarizing the training into this document was something I could build upon and was really helpful. So I took the time to summarize the key resources and lessons I had learned, how I thought I'd implement the training. I briefly described the what and whens and hows and obstacles I thought I might face and how I might overcome them. The value of this course is really evident to me since the scribbled notes I took in class have already become a developing action plan with tasks in progress. And I'm going to share it with you here so you can see the ways in which you might take this course and make it actionable in your workplace. So the first thing I did, my first priority was to understand the methylene chloride, a chemical discussed in class. The class videos really made an impression on me that this very common product that you can find on the shelves of your hardware store is quite dangerous if not used properly with adequate ventilation. So one of the first things I did is I called a few major painting contractors to find out if they were using this chemical on our projects. And I was able to confirm that they were aware of the dangers and they've been using safer alternates for quite some time. So my plan of action is going to be to be on alert for this chemical in other products as I review our project documents. And I might create a bulletin for our teams called Products to Avoid in the future. The second action was to inventory and assess all chemicals used on projects. And I discovered this is quite an overwhelming task because of the sheer volume of chemicals we use. But I outlined some ways in which I might start to identify the products through reviewing architect specifications or our subcontractor submittals on their proposed selections. And less proactively, I could visit the site and take photos of what's in use, or I could pull invoices to find out what we're actually using on the job. But I could also identify some chemicals that stand out based on my past experience. For example, I know that acetone is very flammable and has a high volatile organic compound content. And solvents are not currently mentioned in most green building standards, even though the VOCs are well above the allowable limit for paints and adhesives. Despite the lack of outside pressure to use a different product, it just seems like acetone would be a good candidate to research for safer alternatives. So I put the class training to use, and I explored this chemical. And I first tried the TURI website, the Toxic Use Reduction Institute, where I found a full green screen assessment of acetone. And what I learned there was that acetone has a green screen benchmark score of 2, which says use but search for safer substitutes, based on high flammability and its moderate group 1 human toxicity and endocrine activity. So this science-based research supported my plan of action. To find a substitute, I then used another tool called Subsport website. There, acetone was listed on a few hazards lists like the US EPA and trade union websites, but Subsport did not clearly recommend an alternative, so I Googled and found a few different products, like Turgasol. And the next step is going to be to use the Subsport and Green Screen and other tools to investigate these chemicals that Google turned up for me to further determine an alternative that is indeed safer than acetone. Again, going on products based on past experience, formaldehyde kind of topped the list for us. Formaldehyde is found in composite wood like plywoods, adhesives, insulation, and carpet in my industry. And added urea formaldehyde is a known hazard, federally regulated and prohibited by most green building programs. Phenol and melamine formaldehyde are often the substitutes, the safer alternative chemicals. But are they truly safer was my question. Will the industry regret these substitutions in the future? So I wanted to evaluate the chemicals, and I turned to my training. I went back to Subsport. I found their case story database. I found a specific substance alternatives assessment for formaldehyde, which I'm going to be using for educational communications. This report suggested additional alternatives along with product website links. It also screened these alternates against hazard substance databases. And some of the substitution suggestions came up in my previous work to find alternatives that met green building certification standards. Previously, we'd been using healthy material databases and product labels like Declare or Health Product Declaration documents, but this Subsport resource provided more hazard analysis of the alternates that I found through my past work, but also provided additional products that had not been on my radar. The benefit of this tool was a scientific assessment to confirm that we were headed in a healthier direction. My next step was then to go to toxnot.com and determine if melamine and phenol formaldehyde are listed on any hazardous or regulated lists, and which they are on some regulated lists, and they are on the restricted list for the Living Building Challenge. So I discovered that neither of these chemicals had a green screen, however. So this is something that I'm just going to have to chase down further. There's a lot more work to do on this one, but through this class, I got connected with Saskia Van Bergen of the Washington Ecology, and she provided me recently an article from the Healthy Building Network about the investigation of formaldehydes, and it has been very helpful. So even though my search continues for safer alternatives than formaldehyde, I'm getting closer to being able to identify some safer alternatives. One of the last things that was on my training action plan was during class, I was thinking about all the chemicals we use in our daily operations, like cleaning products. And daily we use stuff like Goof Off, Simple Green, and Windex, but again, wondering if these products are healthy. So I set out to identify the products that we use and determine the toxicity of these cleaning solutions. And this is a rather complicated process, but the good news is that there's an easier route to search for cleaning products, and that's the fact that the EPA has a Safer Choice program that's done all the legwork already. So really what I needed to do was look on the EPA's list and find out if the chemicals that I'm using in our day-to-day work is on the EPA Safer list. I did find Simple Green products, but not specifically the type of products that we use in some of the projects I was able to document. So on the ones that I wasn't able to find on the EPA's list, I used the Green Screen List Translator to look up the individual ingredients listed on the SDS sheets. But ingredients all showed up with some kind of level of hazard. So the only way I knew that we could be certain of a healthier cleaning product was to use the EPA's Safer Choice list. And the biggest obstacle to this is kind of our purchasing controls. We don't have a central resource at this moment. Each team kind of buys their own cleaning products. But my future plans are to talk with our warehouse manager and find out what vendors he uses to buy cleaning products and perhaps create a green cleaning kit based on the EPA Safer Choice program and send out at the start of every project a little toolkit of cleaners. At the bare minimum, we can do that. So to kind of wrap this up, that's a short version of my training action plan in progress. This class helped me take the chemicals of concern I had prior to this class and formulate a more solid plan of action, one which I could implement with minimal effort, and it's something that will continue to grow and evolve over time. And then overall, this training and action plan will help keep our coworkers and partners in the industry healthier and improve our productivity and quality on our projects. I can't think of any industry or company that couldn't benefit from this training, and I strongly recommend this class if you have any interest in improving chemical safety in your workplace, but especially if your role involves specifying, designing, ordering, handling, or applying chemicals. I got way more out of the class than I was expecting, and I was expecting a lot from the Pacific Northwest OSHA Education Center programs. So all I have to say is thank you for listening, and that's it. I'm going to turn it over to Saskia now.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, Harvey, and Jessica. Hopefully you all got a good overview about the toolkit and the training and what you can learn and then do with the training. So if you could put your questions in the question and answer box, I'd appreciate it. I really, Jessica, I think it's a great tool. Congratulations, your team. Harvey is an amazing instructor. As Jennifer said, the hands-on activities, he does a wonderful job engaging the classroom and using the resources available. And I can't say how impressed, Jennifer, what you've done with the course is wonderful to see. Oh, so one of the questions is the next scheduled class. And I've provided a link. Harvey, do you know the next, it's early February, I believe?
Yes, Seattle, first couple days in February, up in the Seattle office.
Could you speak about the locations elsewhere?
Yes, we will be offering the course in February in Seattle. We'll be offering it in Portland. And when you go to the links there, you'll see the locations and the facilities. And then also later this summer out in Tri-Cities in the Richland area. And so they're kind of spaced in the Oregon, Washington area right now. And I'm sure that it probably could be facilitated under contract as well if necessary. But those are open enrollment curriculums, which is that day and a half.
Thank you. Has anyone tried to evaluate the financial costs/savings of work?
It is a discussion point, and there is in the some of the workshops that are done is we're analyzing the costs that are associated with the existing chemicals and their patterns of use versus the alternative and substitutes that may be used, and kind of weighing those out and looking at the pros and the cons. And that's part of our exercises is to look at some of those aspects of those, everything from waste reduction to your, health-related effects that may be generated, those costs, et cetera.
And someone said, I think Jennifer mentioned case studies. Are there case studies available for industry sectors so they don't have to reinvent the wheel?
Sure. So some of the resources that Jennifer mentioned as well in her presentation and what she used and some of her experience in finding some alternatives assessments and other sorts of technical documents that are already out there based on her chemical of concern and the use that she was applying it for. There are many resources out there that are highlighted both in the toolkit and in this training that can help you find what might already be available. And so Jennifer mentioned one, which is Subsport, that people can go to and search a chemical or search a use and get a whole variety of information that's already available out there. Chances are that if you have a high priority chemical or a high priority product, someone has probably looked at it. There's also another set of resources through the Massachusetts Toxic Use Reduction Institute, which are highlighted in both the toolkit and the training, especially around cleaning solvents and solvents used for other purposes, where they've done a lot of evaluation of the various alternatives, not just from a hazard perspective, but also from the performance perspective, so that people can look at that database of alternatives and find information not just on is a chemical less hazardous that might work in this application, but also what performance testing has been done, and does that meet my needs for my company. So I think that both the toolkit and the training can unlock a variety of resources where you may be able to find answers to some of your questions that are already out there.
Excellent, thank you. What is the cost of the class?
I don't know. Let me look in the catalog here. It is, excuse the delay, it looks like it is $350 open enrollment.
Thank you. Question for Jennifer. Can Selling control the use of cleaning products across all its properties? And then are you able to specify preferable cleaning products used by janitorial, custodial contractors and cleaners?
So we're working on trying to be able to control all of our all the purchasing across the projects. We don't have the central purchasing controls like maybe other companies do. You know, if there's something that we need to pick up, you know, extra glass cleaner or something, one of our foremen might stop at the hardware store on their way in or out of work. But I think creating green cleaning kits and putting a list for the EPA Safer Choice program in that kit and starting off every job with it, then the inclination would be to just grab that list and order off from it and just replace what they already have in their kit. So we're working to kind of control that a little bit more. And as far as the chemicals that get used by the occupants once we turn the building over, we do make suggestions all based on the U.S. Green Building Council's operation and maintenance lead rating system. There's a couple lists in that Green Building Certification Program for operation and maintenance cleaning chemicals and processes, and we refer all of our clients to that list to work with their cleaning vendors and janitorial vendors for.
If you have any additional questions, please type them in the question and answer box. I also wanted to mention a couple other recorded resources if they're of interest. The Green Chemistry and Commerce Council has a safer chemistry training for businesses, and there's a link provided, a number of different webinars and resources, as well as this webinar and several others are listed on the Washington State Department of Ecology Green Chemistry and Safer Alternative playlist. And then finally, another program that's out of Washington is the University of Washington Green Chemistry and Chemical Stewardship Certificate Program, which is a much deeper dive into a number of these topics. But hopefully you will be at the OSHA 7225 in the Pacific Northwest in the next year. And if no one else has added any additional questions, so I think a number of people are asking for a number of different resources, which I guess this webinar is a bit of a teaser in the fact that you can go to the toolkit to look at a lot of this information, but a lot of these resources are also available in the manual of the course as well as will be worked on during the training. But if you email me separately, I can provide you with some links, and I will try to follow up with a few of the questions of links that's been asked. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us, and really can't thank enough the speakers. I think that how you described the toolkit as well as the training really gave a very good overview on what you can learn, you know, what the resources are and what you can do with the training. So thank you very much.